All right, Psalm 132. Let's call this one verified because it reminded me of the way in which famous personalities on their platforms will often have a check depending upon which social media platform it is to verify it's actually them as opposed to some random individual posting on their behalf. And this psalm reminded me of that because this is a psalm in which the psalmist is going to recall the struggles of David, but also the promises God made to David. So in verses 1 through 5, they're going to talk about that whole concept of remembering David's hardships. That's literally what it's going to talk about in verse 1, where it says, "Remember, O Lord, in David's favor, all the hardships he endured." Picking up in verses 6 through 7, it's going to say, "Behold, we have heard of it in Ephrathah," meaning we have recalled the things that he endured in the stories, not only his great triumphs, but also his tragedies. But they're going to say in verses 8 through 10, as we recalled in terms of that whole concept of verification, it's one thing for us to celebrate David, for him to be popular with us, but it's another thing for him to be actually verified by God in verses 8 through 10, where they're going to say, "Arise, O Lord, and go to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. Let your priests be clothed with righteousness, and let your saints shout for joy. For the sake of your servant, David, do not turn away the face of your anointed one." As in verses 11 through 18, through the end of the chapter, he is going to give us an indication of the ways in which God would verify that he was with Israel and the work of their hands, specifically in the way that he was blessing them according to his promises to David. Beginning first and foremost, maybe in verse 13, he's going to say, "For the Lord has chosen Zion. He has desired it for his dwelling place. This is my resting place forever." That's the promise. But the evidence is going to seem to pick up in verse 15, where he's going to say, "I will abundantly bless her provisions, and I will satisfy her poor with bread." Verse 16, "Her priests I will clothe with salvation, and her saints will shout for joy." He's going to finish up with a third brand of evidence in verse 17, where he says, "There I will make a horn to sprout for David. I have prepared a lamp for my anointed." And those three verses might seem kind of obscure until you realize that the things that he is promising are things that are beyond the control of the nation. It's one thing for me to make a promise and try to manipulate circumstances to make it seem like it's a prophecy, but these are things that are beyond the control of not only the nation, but even its kings. Beyond that, in verse 16, clothing the priests with salvation. We talked about in previous Psalms the way in which we can crave forgiveness, but not salvation. Craving forgiveness in some ways can be permission if we are not likewise craving the deliverance from the habits that we need forgiveness from. God willing, growing beyond the ability to cling to the appearance that we've done nothing wrong, genuinely hungering and thirsting for a new level of character that will no longer attract the shame for which we seek to be forgiven. And finally, in verse 17, when he's talking about making a horn to sprout for David, that is clearly beyond the power of even Israel's greatest kings. Why? Because David, being among them, realized that at the point he began to take on shady ways in the way he dealt with Uriah, God could pull the kingdom from him in a moment, actually replacing him with his son for a period of time to remind him of that. The line of David also being a contrast to the line of Israel, recognizing the way in which many of the kings of Israel replaced one another through shady means, whether it was flat out insurrection or simply conspiracy, the way in which the kings of Israel replaced one another in temporary kingdoms that did not last, understanding that the only remnant of that kingdom that survived was through the line of Judah. And so the psalmist seems to realize one of the things that the kings of Israel, the northern 10 tribes, didn't. And that is, without God's endorsement or verification, sitting on the throne essentially meant nothing. Or at least it didn't mean much for very long. Thus, when this psalmist is recognizing the ways in which God's priests need to be clothed with righteousness and salvation, he is once again reminding us of the ways in which God's people need to take on the kind of character that God is willing to verify. God willing, with evidence beyond anyone's control.